Hello there.
Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
Did you call for assistance?
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
You don't know the power of the dark side.
You were the chosen one!
All your life you've been in a cage, Padawan. When you're ready.
We would be honored if you would join us.
He was trained in the Jedi art. My only conclusion can be that it was a Sith Lord.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
I do not believe the Sith could have returned without us knowing.
Hard to see the dark side is.
We will use all our resources to unravel this mystery. We will discover the identity of your attacker. May the Force be with you.
Hello there and welcome. This is Star Wars Galactic Archives. I am your host and guide, Darth Tragus. If you're new to the channel, welcome. And if you're a returning Force user from last year, welcome back and Happy New Year. This year itself is going to bring us a lot in Star Wars news, as the release of Star Wars Outlaws video games happens later this year, and many Star Wars shows, one of which is Star Wars The Acolyte that I'm really looking forward to. So to get us ready for that show, we're going to move our topic, and what better way to ring in the new year than some Star Wars lore in history. So let's jump in. Last time we talked about the Jedi Order and the fall of it. We talked about the ascension of the Jedi Order, the differences and the similarities between the two. That we had a balance in the original Jedi Order, that it was both light and dark, and then in the new formation of the Jedi Order, it was mainly bathed in light. Now, as a recap, the Jedi were assembled due to the Tho-Yor and their arrival on Tython, remembering that the Tho-Yor were those 8 ships that went throughout the galaxy, collecting Force-sensitive species and civilizations. One species that we left out, we left out a few, actually. We did it on purpose. I only mentioned a few that were gathered in that episode, but I did it for a reason because we're going to loop back to a couple of these. But one of the civilizations or species that was left out was the Sith. Now, on this podcast, we have both young and old listeners, so some of you are going to know right away what I'm talking about, and others you're going to be a little bit confused. So not everyone knows the same information, and that's why I really want to try to cover as much as I can within these episodes. Because when I just said the Sith, your mind might have just gone to, what are you talking about? The Sith? That's Darth Vader, Palpatine, Darth Maul. But that's the order of the Sith. When we're referring to the Sith, which is one of my favorite topics to talk about, being that I am a Darth Lord, there's the Sith order and the Sith species. They are 2 separate entities. So what's the difference? Now, simplistically put, the Sith Order is the adaptation, philosophy, and practices of the Sith culture over years of intermingling with the Sith species itself, learning and adapting to their views and philosophies. The Sith species is both separate and connected to the Sith Order, in that way that the Sith as a species help create the Sith Order, but they are still their own body. They're the creation of it. Now, I know it's a little confusing, but that's why we're here. That's why we've put this episode together, which, when we originally put this episode together, it was ironically getting near Christmas, and for a lot of Star Wars fans, instead of Merry Christmas, we'll go Merry Sithmas. So it was kind of funny that when I was putting this together, we had Christmas time coming around. So the Sith term was just adapted over time from the original species name to just refer to any dark-sided user. That's why right away when we hear the term Sith, we think of this dark, evil character, Darth Vader, Emperor Palpatine, Darth Maul. Now, whether we want to say it was the Jedi or common people that did this, that made it the more generic term, I'll leave that to you to decide. We could spend the entire episode breaking that apart, trying to figure out and put together pieces to have our argument state of who did that. It's not really important who did it or even why it was done, but over history, that's just been your generic term, that at one point in time, the Sith referred to the species, the actual inhabitants of Korraban. But later on, through fights, battles, history itself, it just filtered and channeled its way, like a lot of terms that we have in our own planet. So, let alone the Sith are one of my favorite topics, like I said in Star Wars, with following the beings of the Jedi, we are soon going to reach a point of a crossroads of collisions, as it were. That's why I thought we would stop with our timeline. All of these episodes that I do, I'm trying to start us as far back as we can and converge forward. Now, a lot of these episodes aren't going to be in chronological order because we're going to have to hit points where we stop, pull back. And that's what we're going to do here. With last time's episode, we had just stepped on the first step of the ascension of the Jedi Order. The Jedi had fallen. We were nearing what's going to be called the First Great Schism. So the point is, we're going to have civilizations crossing paths. We're going to have them intermingling. So I thought it was a great time to stop, pull back, and hit another branch that's going to connect into our main limb here. We tend to forget that the Star Wars universe is not just one pebble in the pond, but multiple pebbles all over the galaxy. Remember, the Tho-Yor gathered many Force-sensitive species, but not all, and not the whole species. They didn't gather every single species throughout the galaxy. Remember, the Tho-Yor gathered civilization species that were connected to the Force, but both had evolved and gotten at different levels of connection to the Force. When they arrived on Korraban to acquire Sith, they didn't take the whole species, just like they didn't take all of the Wookiees from Kashyyyk. They didn't take all the humans where they were. They didn't take all of the Dai Bendu. They took a select few. Only the Force called to only so many to gather them. For what reasons? That's really unclear, and we could break that down for hours on end. But the point is, they grabbed a handful, pulled them off-world. They no longer had any communication or physical connection to that planet anymore. So once they were scooped up and off that planet, those left behind were still left to their own devices. They still had their own history to connect to. So the Sith are a prime example of what has happened to many planets after the Tho-Yor gathered species and left. Just because they left the planet didn't mean that everything else died or just went away on that planet. It continued to move forward. So we have both Sith that came to the Jedi Order, which you had a both balance of light and dark, and you had Sith who were still on the planet of Korraban. Now, those Sith that came to the Jedi Order, if they had some struggles, because as we'll find out, the Sith species on Korraban had a very strong connection to the dark side. Now, that opens up a whole can of worms, and it's going to lead to more episodes coming up of just because you have dark-sided capabilities, does that make you inherently evil? Does that make you that you're written in destiny, that that's where you're supposed to go and that's the only place you'll be? So we learn in media later on in years of the Sith, but it's more the Sith Order when we're first introduced to it into The Phantom Menace. But what you may not know is the Sith species is one of the oldest in the galaxy, going back over 200,000 years, for 200,000 BBY at the minimum. When the Dark Jedi later come across the Sith species, they see this ancient people, but this is not where they had always been. If any of you get the chance to read it, it's called Book of Sith or Book of the Sith. You can find it in any Barnes & Nobles or Amazon store. There's a story in there where the Dark Jedi first come to Korraban and they interact with the Sith. Now, how they're described is, I don't want to say primitive, but a mixture of barbaric, heathenistic style people, but that's not where they always were. The planet of Korraban and its history of its inhabitants literally is over 200,000 years. So it has gone up and down considerably, where you had high technological feats, and then it got wiped down to the bare bones, and it had to start over. So you had this ancient Egyptian Mayanistic style people that had tech, if you can try to wrap your mind around that. So their society would rise and groan and dwindle constantly, and this could be argued of how the Sith Order itself later was influenced with their code and philosophy of struggle and strife. The Sith Order constantly has had Dark Lords who refer to this as the struggle or the conflict, and something that a Sith dark side Dark Lord should have in their abilities, in their way of life. So the Sith had a natural symbiotic relationship fused with the dark side. They fed on it and empowered it, developed and perfected techniques of the dark side through it that were once thought impossible, such as sorcery. Though they had a great power, the Sith were not united and lived in tribal circles, as it were, led by one or more Sith sorcerers who were responsible for the safety and protection of their people. Now, we talked about it and touched on it a little bit when we did our episode of Korraban, the planet, during our Halloween trip. We went to many dark-sided planets and dove into the cultures and societies that dwelled on those planets. This episode today, we're going to retouch on a lot of topics that we briefly mentioned in that episode. I'll leave the episode in the link below in the descriptions. But we're going to try to break it apart a little bit more, actually dive into it a little bit further, because we want to build as much as we can moving forward to understand, just like we did with the Jedi, of their society, their culture, and their history behind it. Now, the state of war between the Sith nations on Korraban was common in their society, but this existence was treated as one par with peace and serenity by the Sith people. They did not or could not differentiate one state from another, and this, including with barbaric practices, was accompanied and accepted into Sith society, not as being agnostic or contrary, but intermingled to their lives, just a part of their basic everyday. They could not see barbaric practices that they undertook as anything else but their only way to live. Their ultimate existence, the Sith civilization described as such, was said to have begun around the year 100,000 BBY. However, like I said, there is evidence to contain and prove that they were in existence far beyond that. There is a holocron that was recorded by a Jedi in 69 BBY or 6900 BBY that chronicles the monuments of the Valley of the Dark Lords, that they stood long before the advent of the Zell civilization on the planet Coruscant around 200,000 BBY. So it was speculated among historians that several of the ancient Sith practices, such as the consumption of blood soup, was done in a pre-Sith history, and you do have ancient Jedi who make mention, because obviously they were talking to Sith on their planet of Tython, that these practices, this way of life, and these beings, that they had stories from long ago and that they did all these great things. So it's not hardcore proof. We don't have a lot of information. That's why we started where we did with these episodes, because the further back you go, it gets more into speculation. But it is on good ground and good argument that the civilization has been around for a long, long time. So during this early time, this early build of the Sith, they recorded information in scrolls, on tombs, and tablets. These contained dark knowledge, such as writings that describe dark side powers, alchemy, the construction of Sith weapons, and artifacts. However, many of these ancient writings were imbued with the madness of those Sith who wrote them, and consequently the knowledge was capable of driving unprepared seekers of knowledge to insanity. It was known that the Sith already had a great knowledge of the depths of their own power by this era, specifically the rage and the revenge that led to the dark side of the Force. Demonstrating this, the Sith drove off any invasion by the Killiks around 30,000 BBY. Now, these would be around the time after the Tho-Yor arrived. Remember, around 36,453 BBY, the Tho-Yor pyramids. These ships gathered the galaxy's best Force-sensitive philosophers, priests, scientists, warriors from around the galaxy, and they brought them to Tython. Some of the members, like we said, were the Sith species that they were taken from Korraban, eventually becoming the first Jedi. Now, after 10 millennia of the studying of balance between of what would be called the light and dark sides of the Force, descendants of these founders still existed as Jedi Masters, journeyers, and diplomats in the Tython system. Shortly before the Force Wars, an event caused the light and dark side of the Force to polarize within the minds of the Jedi, eventually culminating the formation of the Jedi Order. We talked about in that previous episode of the fall of the Jedi and what all happened there. So you have the Sith on Korraban. They have their own battles happening not too long after, just a few thousand years after the Tho-Yor left, there was an invasion that happened. So it's not surprising that the Sith were a proud and violent species. Now, we're going to get into, we touched on it a little bit, like I said, in our Korraban episode, but we're going to try to break down a little bit both the biology and appearance of the Sith, their hybridization, their society, culture, the caste, the technology. We're going to try to break that all down today. So the Sith species was a humanoid-esque species. The Sith had a larger than average number of individuals with potential to use the Force in their species on the planet of Korraban. So high, in fact, that the entire species was considered strongly Force-sensitive. Now, the abundance of Force sensitivity resulted in a symbiotic relationship with the dark side of the Force, where they, like the other few creatures that inhabited the planet, derived sustenance directly from the dark side of the Force and empowered it in turn. Remember, we've seen this in Ahsoka and other episodes of new Star Wars shows. It's repeating what Yoda said in Empire Strikes Back, where the Force is all around us. It literally engulfs everything. But as we find out throughout lore and history, TV shows, movies, comics, novels, some species are just more attuned with it. We're talking about the Sith here, so they're going to have a strong connection to the dark side. There are other civilizations that have a very strong pull to the light side. Now, it's interesting that this happens throughout Star Wars because, like what we covered with the Jedi, that was the organization of balance. So it's interesting that throughout the galaxy, you have some that are strongly drawn to the dark side, strongly drawn to the light side. But the Tho-Yor went out to try to bring these species together to create a balance, to get a more peaceful resolution, as it were. Now, we won't try to go off topic and down the rabbit hole too far there, but it's just interesting on that effect that you have all these species that they're pulled in different directions. They all have their talents, just like everybody does. But there was an attempt at one time to bring a calming peace, or just, like we said, balance to it. So when we're talking about the Sith and what they looked like, here's what you're going to picture. You're going to have a humanesque style figure with either red-skinned, sometimes pink skin, and very rarely you have gray-skinned beings. Now, off of these characters, they'll have long tendrils coming down off the sides of their face, numbering from 2 or 3 to almost 5 or 6. The number literally varies. There's no defining amount on there. The Sith had sharp, fierce, predatory profiles and features all over their bodies, including bone spears protruding from under their skin at various locations, like their eyebrows. Their faces displayed notable pairs of cheek tendrils that hung down from their high cheekbones. Sith also had cranial horns, pointed teeth, simian mouths below their noses, and glowing yellow eyes. They sound very intimidating, I know. Now, most Sith had 3 clawed digits on each hand, and 3 on each foot. 2 forward-facing and 1 backward-facing. However, some Sith had 5 digits on their hands and feet. The Sith were commonly left-handed too. They were left-handed dominant. It's also a misconception with the Sith species, if you've ever played the game Knights of the Old Republic, that the cutscenes that are shown from there and Sith within the order that is later shown, they're showed as bald. That's not always the case. Both male and female Sith species, they had hair. Some of the Massassi had very long, very mane-like hair. Others, like I said, if you've played Knights of the Old Republic, there's characters in there that they're very well groomed, very well kempt hair. Some, yes, are bald. They do shave their heads. They're as normal as any other species. It all is genetics, the personal preference of the individual itself. But a lot of people, when they look up Sith and they come across the dark-robed, red-skinned characters, you see them constantly bald. But that's not always the case. Both males and females have different range of hairstyles and even facial hair too. It's not common, it is on the rare side to have males with facial hair due to the appendages that come down off of their face, but it's not uncommon to see a small goatee or even, we'll call it 5 o'clock shadow, if you will, coming off of their face. It all depends. It literally does. So now, we mentioned the Sith and we mentioned the Massassi. The Massassi is going to be a off-branch of the Sith. The Sith as a whole is no different than what we would call a human, if you want to compare the two. But just to say you're a human on planet Earth, you're a Sith on Korraban, there's different types of Sith, or there's different types of castes within the culture. So going into the culture first, they were in almost constant state of war, like we said. Their civilization, though, was quite sophisticated. They saw these acts not as cruel or barbaric, but simply basic aspects of existence. They were notable for engaging in supposedly primitive practices, such as sentient sacrifices in the name of their gods. Remember, we're covering a long strand of history. When we look at our own history, look at both Christianity, paganism, look at how all those cultures waned and groaned throughout the time. Their constant warring on Korraban led to a dwindling of population on their own original world of Korraban, as well as cultivated and intensified xenophobic society. Eventually, they would have to leave Korraban. But during the time they were there, the planet would rupture and grow throughout time that they just adapted to it. They tried to make the best of it. So while we're here, let's talk about the different castes of Sith. You had it's sometimes referred to as subspecies of Sith. You have the main embodiment, but then you have the different categories that go on within it. You have the Massassi, who are notably these big, barbaric, very huge individuals. They were the warrior caste of the Sith. This was because the Massassi tended to be taller and stronger than other Sith castes. This, combined with the natural Sith aggression, made it very efficient and vicious soldiers for the Sith military. Massassi were not very intelligent. We're not saying they were stupid, but they could be trained well enough to carry out complex battle plans and maintain their Sith equipment, starships, weaponry, making them very useful to the Sith Empire that would later form. The Massassi's loyalty had to be earned, but once it was, they were obedient to a fault. They followed their Dark Lord to the edge of the abyss. They were also loyal to individual Sith lords they served, though this loyalty was secondary to their loyalty to the Dark Lord that they would have. The Massassi also had a complex language of their own, which may be related to original Sith language, because, like we said, they're not stupid, the Massassi, but they didn't have the high intellect, we'll say, that they wanted to change their culture. They kept pretty basic. I said it in the episode before, you could, on the Korraban episode, you could kind of relate Massassi to almost a early Dark Ages civilization, that they went out, they were very warlike, but they kept to their traditions, but they didn't look for ways to really evolve it all that much. If it was weaponry, they would try to evolve their weapons a little bit, but other than that, they were really to hold on to their beliefs, to their culture, and they didn't find a need to expound on that at all. The Massassi are also notable to have helped Naga Sadow in his battle and his takeover of Yavin 4. A lot of times you'll see pictures of the Old Republic or the early Sith Empire, and these are the individuals you will see, these very big, almost linebacker-esque style creatures. Now, another caste would be the Kasai. The Kasai were your priest class of the Sith. They were known to study the nature of the dark side of the Force and practice of ancient Sith magic and alchemy. The Kasai were just as ruthless as the Massassi, but they were more intelligent, more observant, and lacked the physical advantages of the Massai. The Kasai, they were more commonly the pinkish, lighter red-skinned individuals. They would be more narrow build. I don't want to say they were weak in any sense, but they fed off their strengths. They didn't have the body build of a Massassi, so they played to their intellect. They played to their preferences, their skill set. There was nothing wrong with it. That's just where that genre of caste went. Now, another caste was the Zuguruk. The Zuguruk were notably loyal engineers who built and maintained Sith technology, including droids, starships, and tombs. This group didn't really feed off of fighting. Again, they weren't ones that were very large, very bulky. They tended, you had a lot of them that were more gray colored in skin tones. They were almost your middle ground, we could say, that they didn't go into high theology or high intellect of study, but they were very good with their hands. They understood Sith technology. They understood how to work on something, how to maintain it, how to keep the entire Sith society, the Sith Empire moving. You have to have these parts of a civilization. You have to have your muscle. You have to have your intellect, and you have to have somebody in the middle who, if called upon, yes, they could fight. They're not going to like run away from it or anything. That's, like we said, it's in their society of what they do. But you have these individuals who can go out and they can rip apart a dashboard of a starship or work on something within the town center to keep the power generators moving. The priests aren't going to have time for that. They're studying. The Massassi aren't going to have time for that. They're training for war. So you have to have somebody in the middle who's taking care of that. Now, we're not going to say the Zugaruk were at the bottom, because there's another caste that we'll call it a caste, but it's technically not, because it's a group that moves throughout the whole planet itself, and that's slaves. So while it's not a full caste like the others, slaves still occupied an important part of the Sith social order. Sith slaves could be any type of species. They could be human, they could be Twi'lek, any species that the Sith encountered and ruled over, that became their slaves. Very early on, the Sith were referred to as pure-blooded, and if you were anything but Sith, you were a slave. You could not, for the longest time, and even after the formation of the Sith Order that would later happen from Dark Jedi, if you were not of Korraban, if you weren't a Massassi, a Zugaruk, a Kisai, you were a slave. You were at the bottom of the totem pole, and there was your grunt work. That was what you did there. Now, later on, when you had the Dark Jedi that would arrive on Korraban, during the time that we will later get into, known as the First Great Schism, you did have the culmination of Sith species and humans that would evolve into the term of purebloods. And they would have more common 4-digit hands and feet than the 5 that would eventually come around, filtering out less and less of the 3-digit individuals of their hands. You would see more humanistic characteristics coming around their faces and less of the bulky Massassi figures. It would eventually, the genetics would just filter through of more of a humanistic style. But that didn't mean that the standard of pure blood went away. For the longest time, you still had to have the very strong Sith features of at least some type of tendrils, of the red skin that is more commonly known, but it would filter through. But slaves throughout society would stay for a very, very long time. So let's touch on the technology. Like we said at the beginning of the episode, when we're first introduced to the Sith culture, society, the species itself, when the Dark Jedi arrive onto the planet, we think, and we're introduced to them, that we seem to think that they're this barbaric, that they don't know how to do anything. And that's not true. The Sith art of alchemy allowed them to imbue objects as well as living beings with the dark side of the Force. Due to their great skill in sorcery and magic, the Sith often created talismans in order to focus their concentration, as well as to further tap great amounts of dark-sided power into such objects. Such artifacts were often used during long, elaborate rituals and allowed a sorcerer to temporarily enhance their abilities. Whatever they took, they gave right back into it. It's kind of hard to imagine a dark-sided Force user that we commonly think of it that they're just taking and taking and taking, but they're taking to give back to strengthen themselves back up. Now, yes, that opens another whole rabbit hole that's like, well, they're giving back just to get more dark side. But they're not just taking away and running away from it. They have the intelligence and the foresight to be, we want to pull this out to elaborate or engulf us even stronger to use the dark side of the Force. So during ancient times, the Sith often made use of tomes and manuscripts to record their knowledge. These scrolls and tablets contain teachings on how to learn certain techniques ranging from alchemy to weapon crafting to magic. It was only later that the Sith began to adopt holocrons as teaching tools. One piece of technology that did not originate from the Sith was holocrons, which had been originally adapted from the Rakata. Following this event, holocrons became a preferred method of storing Sith teachings, though they were considered rare. By transferring a portion of a user's personality into the device, as well as imbuing it with the Force, they were capable of creating a gatekeeper, as it were, that was a sentient presence that interacted with future users. There's many times where we have both Dark Lords, Sith, of the Sith Order, Jedi, that they find a Sith holocron, and the character they're conversing with, it's not necessarily a recording. It's able to interact with them and converse with them in real time. It's because it has the essence of the previous being. Now, in some cases, the being that it's talking to has the perception that it can actually manipulate the Force, and that it's actually another piece of the person that could act in that time and frame. As the different creators of holocrons had different specialities, it meant that these data storage devices often contain aspects of a single field of Sith lore, not the whole. This had led to the side effect of certain Sith teachings being lost because the knowledge was either never recorded or it was destroyed on those holocrons. Those holocrons that had survived over the years either fell into the hands of the dark side acolytes or remained within the sanctuaries of the dead Sith Lords. We see it over time where, like we said, Jedi and Sith go to these tombs or ancient places to find the Sith holocrons to use this knowledge later on. Now, Sith alchemy was also regularly used in the creation of weapons such as Sith swords. This would be before lightsabers. Remember, we haven't even reached that yet. We haven't reached the power packs that eventually create our lightsabers. We're still on like your basic medieval style swords. These blades were one of the earliest weapons made by the Sith and were remarkably effective. Each blade was treated so that they were reinforced to withstand any blow, which allowed them to combat lightsabers in later years. Their unique creation also meant that they were capable of surviving for thousands of years in perfect conditions. You have weapons that last for eons, that sit in a tomb that you can pick it up and it's still as sharp and as effective as the day it was first pulled out of the forge. Now, this talent of Sith alchemy wasn't limited to just creating physical weapons. It also extended to create biological weapons, which allowed them to genetically engineer cultures to become tainted abominations. We covered this again in our episode of Korraban, that a lot of the animals and the beasts of the planet were manipulated and regrown to feed more spiritually and physically off the dark side of the Force. That you had these Sith bloodhounds, you had these bat-like creatures that just fed off of dark energy and fear. That just like a sharp sword of the Sith, you had these razor-fanged beasts that when you came to Korraban in its golden age, as it were, you had such fierce beasts that protected the planet that it was a rough place to live. The Sith themselves took great pride in living here, but these beasts that would come out of everywhere just would shred you apart. Now, Sith were noted for considering the construction of structures and edifices to be work of art. They felt that such buildings were an extension of their creator's personality. This had the resulting effect of preventing enemies from being able to properly cart off and take away their structures. They engineered their Sith alchemy into the buildings. It was everywhere. Later, we will talk about it, that how the Jedi don't want to use alchemy. In the Jedi Order, when they first started, you could do it to a point, but there was still like a gray area that you can experiment on this, you can use a little bit of it, but don't go too far. It was not quite taboo, but in the Jedi Order, strictly taboo. You don't mess with alchemy. That's not necessary. We don't touch that at all. Within the Sith culture, which we're not going to say that that's how all of it originated from, but in this, you had alchemy being dove into both weaponry, into animals, into their architecture. It was to help embody the whole. They might have fought with the different civilizations and different castes that we said within Korraban, but the whole point was, if I fight with you, I'll make you stronger. You fight me, you become stronger. And the Sith as a people, even though they're not unified, the Sith as a species becomes stronger because of the conflict. So we want to make sure that we put all of this alchemy, this spells, all these talismans, we want to keep our civilization moving forward to become stronger and better to dominate the other civilizations within the galaxy. Now, some of these weapons that we can mention would be the Sith meditation sphere that we would later see used by Darth Revan, and dark super weapons such as the Dark Reaper that was constructed during the years of the Great Hyperspace War. That would come later on. One notable weapon, or weapons that we could say because they were pairs, would be not only the dark swords that the Sith created, but also axes. One such pair of axes was wielded by King Adas, a ruler of the Sith that would join the societies together. But that we will save for next time. So please stay tuned to catch that episode. Now, I plan on doing some giveaways throughout this year, and I'll be starting with one next time with that episode coming up. I'm reminded of a quote: if you can't do great things, do small things in a great way. And this podcast is not the great Star Wars story that we all know and love. I can only hope to add small tidbits to that body that is Star Wars. So if you would like to do your small part, please share the podcast with a friend, or an enemy, or just the Ewok next to you. It would be greatly appreciated. And I will do my part to pay you back with both this podcast and with the giveaways throughout this year. Star Wars Galactic Archives is written, edited, and produced by me, Darth Tragus. Assistance and encouragement is also given by Corrine Radio and Jesse's Face Painting. Be sure to follow us on Spotify, YouTube, and all other podcast platforms. Be sure to email us at StarWarsGalacticArchives@gmail.com and stop by our website at StarWarsGA.com. Until next time, I am Darth Tragus. May the Force guide you.